Okay, let's move to the next topic, which is GPSS. So, like we said, you have been you were the president.
Yeah, thankfully not anymore.
Not anymore. Okay, I think you're having an easier time. Right?
Yeah. I'm much more enjoying my life. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But before we go into like your work in GPSS, can you tell the audience what is GPSS? What does it do? Why is it important? Yeah.
So most public higher ed institutions have a system of what's called shared governance. And these are typically, in most institutions, they're kind of a glorified student council, right? They're representatives from different stakeholders across a university. So the students, the grad students, the staff, the AP faculty, the faculty, of course. And they sort of come together in pseudo, you can think of it as like senatorial bodies, right? So they vote on stuff, they can pass resolutions, they can make statements on behalf of their constituents. It's like a representative government sort of internal system to higher education. And most universities don't take it super seriously, to be honest. Like, they're always important, and it's important to serve in this capacity, but most universities don't put a lot of weight behind it. Virginia Tech is unique because we actually do have a lot of weight in our shared governance system, surprisingly. And our governance system is broken up into 5 main constituents: the undergraduate student senate, the staff senate, the AP faculty senate, the faculty senate, and then my senate, which was the graduate and professional student senate, or GPSS. These senates basically work with different smaller groups called commissions or committees to produce policy changes at the university. And most of the policy changes that we see at the university have to go through shared governance, even if the president wants it, right? So the president can say, I want a policy on Title IX stuff. Great. It has to be reviewed by shared governance to get everybody's buy-in for it. Until it gets passed, then it can be changed by that office, but that's neither here nor there. So when I was GPSS president, I saw an opportunity, because I had been involved in shared governance for several years at that point, to take my knowledge of how the institution works. Because much like the Senate itself, it operates by Robert's Rules of Order. It's often complicated. Most people don't know how to make a motion or what a resolution even looks like. That's an obstacle to democracy. And, you know, I had a lot of, like, several years of experience. I'm a political scholar, so I'm familiar with this jargon. And I decided, you know, when I was president, to really spearhead policy change as my main drive. Okay. And not only that, is I felt as though graduate students are in a unique position as sometimes faculty, sometimes staff, sometimes students, to really tackle some cross-cutting issues that affected the entire university. Some ethical and political issues that really affect the entire university. So when I was doing the listening sessions, I was trying particularly to listen to 4 issues that resonated with that cross-cutting nature and emphasize those. Either things that affected all graduate students, like our pay, or things that were like ethical commitments to the university that we should have a say in, like where our fees go to, or what businesses we're invested in as a foundation. And the shared governance system is one way to make those policy changes a reality of the institution. And it's one that's governed by discussion and advancing and votes. And I thought that, you know, maybe if I could make the case successfully, I'd be able to get this through.
Okay. So, okay, just before we take this further, I want to... I was part of GPSS, actually. Well,
really?
It was called GSA.
Yes.
Then. I was like the representative of my department, the graduate students at the computer science department, right? So I am somewhat familiar with like how it works, the whole voting and you know, like how discussions happen and all of that. But you use the terminology here that even I might not really know exactly what it means, which is shared governance.
Yes.
Okay. So can you unpack that term for us? What does shared governance mean? Because for me, when I hear shared governance, it means like students are involved in the governance of the university. I don't know if I'm right or wrong. You can correct me. But after defining that term for us, can you? Because to me, I'm like, I don't think students really share the governance of the university. They just give input and suggestions, but those carry almost no real weight in the decision making at the higher levels. So you can correct me if my impression is wrong, but could you define the term for us and then talk about like do we really have real shared governance?
Yeah, and when I was talking about other universities not putting a lot of weight in shared governance, you've hit exactly why, right? Like the students will provide their opinion, but there's no real sharing of governance. And I think you defined it correctly. It's the idea that the operations of the university are shared between the different stakeholders in the university. Okay. And if you take a look at even our renewed shared governance system, and I was on the team that revised our most recent version of shared governance, even though it's a value, and even though we do better than most other universities, I still don't think it's a shared governance institution by any means. For example, we have this strange body at the top of our shared governance called the University Council Cabinet, which is headed up by the provost and the faculty senate president. It has like the leadership of the different senates and commissions on it. It's a relatively small group. And they decide if something's relevant or not for shared governance. Well, in a real shared governance system, you would never have some sort of authorizing body like that. You'd have it be democratically decided by the constituent groups who are advancing these policies. And then the other constituent groups would get an opportunity to vote on whether or not they agree that this is within our purview. And they're trying to do that a little bit through a representative format, but it's not shared governance, and I don't think we're under any illusions that's the case. But that's not to say it isn't important or that it can't lead to policy change. And part of what my goal was that year was to really push the limits of what shared governance at Virginia Tech could be. Mm-hmm. I was advancing things that I knew likely didn't have a big shot of being policy, simply because I was curious to know, okay, where are the limits of real democracy at this institution? When does the buck stop and the president intervenes and says, it was actually rarely the president, he's pretty hands-off on this, which is nice. He's actually pretty receptive to student feedback, surprisingly. Okay. I give President Sands a lot of grief usually, and so I just wanted to give him credit where credit's due. He is very receptive to student feedback, more than most university presidents. But really, when I was advancing stuff like, I advanced a resolution to try to defund the police. I knew the police weren't going to be defunded, but I was curious that if I could get the students to buy into this, right? If there was legitimate support for this proposal from the undergrads, the grad students, maybe even the staff, would this be taken seriously? Because I think that even if it's not adopted, if a shared governance system is working, these policies, if they have the support of constituents, need to be at least taken seriously. And it wasn't. It was sort of killed off quietly in a committee that I couldn't get access to the records of. And, I think that tells us one of the limits of using shared governance as a tactic in making change at this university. Okay. Other things, it turned out I was successful beyond my dreams, and I was honestly surprised I was able to get through. So the living wage campaign for graduate students, which was probably my most well-known endeavor, was successful, and in a couple weeks is probably going to be heard by the Board of Visitors.
More in
for sure,
like briefly. Yeah.
But that I genuinely was surprised when that went through, and it took a lot of work. We had to get people to show up to these meetings and really push hard to make people know that this was an important issue to not just the graduate students, but faculty and undergrads and staff. But we did, and it went through. And so it's really sort of a give and take trying to negotiate the boundaries of what shared governance could be. And I think it's a little bit more limited this year than in years past, but still surprisingly open to feedback if folks want to make change. Right. Feel free to send me an email and I'll teach you how to write a resolution anytime.
Yeah. I am going to ask you in a bit about like the kind of resolutions you tried to push for. And so we'll get to that. But before that, I want to ask you maybe a philosophical question. I don't know. So if this, like in a democratic system, democracy has evolved over time. So democracy used to be like, it's in ancient Greece, not every one of the citizens had the right to vote, right? Even like, I think, was it Plato that said only philosophers should be able to vote or something like that?
Should be kings, yeah.
Should be kings, okay. So and then you had slavery, and the slaves did not have the right to vote. So now, if we project that on the university system, okay, you have this. I'm really bad with names. You called it the board of.
University Council Cabinet. Yeah.
Cabinet. Okay, you called it the cabinet. So this cabinet is really the body that makes the decisions, right? Is that
yes, more or less. So the president ultimately makes the decisions, but yes, more or less the University Council Cabinet in practice makes decisions.
Right. So the students don't have a real vote, right? They can make recommendations, right? So in such a system, what are the motivations and let's say, what are the motivations that make the cabinet and the president listen to the students? Is it because if they don't listen, the students will go out in protests and maybe publish things on blogs and YouTube talking about them? Is it because they're good people and they want to listen? Like, I have a hard time if a system doesn't have a mechanism that enforces the rights of certain people. I feel like the system will fail them eventually. Yeah. So I am asking you here, like, what are your thoughts on this? Because if there's no real mechanism for students to vote, actually vote, what is making the university listen to them?
Yeah, that's a hard question, but it comes back to social movements and the power we can exert as a population. Truly, you're right to say that the thing that makes the university listen is, at the end of the day, people power. It's the idea of, like, we have a strength collectively that none of us has individually, and that far exceeds our ability to vote on something. And this is true of electoral politics in general, for what it's worth. I think there are genuinely good people in the administration who listen and make changes based on it. The dean of the graduate school, Dean Serpernot, went back and forth with my team frequently, and eventually got to a pretty good working relationship where we would suggest things that were just like positive quality of life changes, and she would take that seriously, that they were coming on behalf of the grad students, and just work to implement them. So there are also legitimately well-meaning people at the university, but when you're talking about $1 billion enterprise, you can't rely on goodwill of a couple people in the higher up, because that's not how change gets made, and that's not how safeguards are kept safe, as you correctly pointed to. And so, the meat of the matter and why I decided to take such an aggressive approach is because I was seeing a situation where the students had been failed legitimately for so long and so severely that I felt like there needed to be a huge course of action, and that some of these limitations of shared governance needed to be exposed. Because I was consistently running into the situation where we were told, anybody who makes changes at university is told this. Go through the proper channels, talk to X, talk to Y, run a resolution through, go all through these. And I'd experienced in years past just how bad that advice can be if you actually want to make change.
How so?
Well, I remember a resolution a couple years ago advanced by the undergrads. It was pretty straightforward, actually. The undergrads were worried that non-Christian holidays weren't being respected by faculty members. And so a Jewish student was pushing forward a resolution to get major holidays in the Jewish tradition, like Yom Kippur, recognized by the university calendar, just so that if a Jewish student took off, they could point to the calendar and be like, it's my most holy holiday. Same with Muslim students, same with indigenous students who all operate on different religious calendars. And basically just offer protections for students who weren't Christian and don't get those holidays off by default. I saw that resolution die a death by 1,000 cuts, where eventually something passed that kind of does that. But now if a student wants those protections, they have to go to student affairs and get a certificate and then send that to the faculty who can deny it. And then the student has to prove that they're actually doing this. And it became a whole convoluted process for what at the end of the day is like a relatively straightforward and I think uncontroversial thing to do, right? Is just say, we're not a Christian university. And so that I've seen happen to so many different policy changes and people who just want to do good at the university. And that's doing people a disservice. And they end up, if, this is the classic thing in social movements, and I try to explain this to the administration, that people will always try to do things the nice way first, try to do things the right way. Okay. It's easier. You don't get into fights. Nobody likes getting into fights. But if a change needs to be made and the nice ways are cut off, they're going to get protests on their hands. They're going to get bad press. They're going to have the undergrads telling people not to come here because Virginia Tech doesn't respect, religious minorities. And that's, a very strong incentive for the administration as well. And it's how we got the climate policies passed, actually, is we tried to get, an audience with Tim Sands about it. He listened and nothing much came out of it, but it wasn't until the students marched to Burris Hall and were like, hey, we're 1,000 students and we need to update our climate policies. Then they listen. Okay. Then we see movement. Okay. And nobody wants to organize a rally of 1,000 people. It's so stressful. But, sometimes if the change is important enough to people, they will. And I find that really interesting for how we shift the needle in big institutions like this, because that's our main power, unless you're an administrator making six figures.
Okay, so it seems the nice channels sometimes get you somewhere, but it's where most ideas go to the graveyard of ideas slowly. and you think from what you're saying, it's like something like a civil movement is really what gets the higher ups' attention to act on things.
Yeah, I'm a big believer in a social movement theory of change. I think that not just at this institution, but at all institutions across the United States, the biggest changes and the most important changes are not made through people playing nice, but people advancing social movements.
Okay.
I think this is just a historical reality we see. You don't free slaves by being nice to slave owners. You free slaves by burning down the plantations. And I think that, that is how the majority of positive change in this country has been made, are those sorts of radical actions. But when you're in a position of power, you want to discourage those. And so for that reason, that's why some of the easier paths of least resistance will often work. Sometimes because you run to the right person, they believe in it, and they support you, and they get it done, right? But most of the times, the paths of least resistance work because they're sort of like steam valves for the institution. They're preventing those larger actions from happening by giving concessions. And sometimes those concessions aren't good enough. The grad students are still keeping an eye on the living wage stuff despite us getting a 5% raise last year, because a 5% raise doesn't match the need of...
if the pay is already low, 5% is not going to make it much higher.
No, it's not, especially when we have a 7% inflation. It's a 2% pay cut, actually.
Right. Okay, we'll get to that. I wanted... one question that I have been... sorry, I'm just fixing this.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. So one question I have, and I have talked to someone about this before, is... And I think you are really actually the expert on this, so I am very interested in your opinion. So GPSS is a Senate, right? So there are these terminologies that are thrown around, like Senate, Council, Student Union, right? And I believe they don't mean the same thing. I don't know what the difference is. You probably can tell me, but I am under the impression that a union is more powerful than a Senate, and it can actually create change. So I want to ask you, first of all, what is the difference? Why would a union make more impact? Second of all, has there been historically, to your knowledge, or have you been involved in any unionization efforts? And if so, what were the obstacles or difficulties?
Yeah, so I'm gonna speak from my academic experience here because I'm very interested in this question of unionization. So first off, the difference. Any sort of shared governance body is already internal to the system. It's already a part of how Virginia Tech works. It has established protocols. It responds to the president. And that's the biggest difference, is at the end of the day, the Graduate and Professional Student Senate, they make recommendations to the president, and they're accountable to the president. And they're somewhat accountable to the grad students, but they're mostly accountable to the president, right? They get their funding through the president, they get their support through the university, and that's who they're beholden to and who all their material interests are aligned with. Unions, on the other hand, are a pure expression of people power. It's basically a group of, let's say, graduate students in this instance, coming together around a common purpose to advance things that help the graduate students and that the graduate students need, in flexing the fact that graduate students are a main employee of this university and keep it running to get changes made. So they can take far more aggressive tactics because their resources come from graduate students, and they're accountable to graduate students and not the university president. So they can threaten things like a strike. If the Graduate and Professional Student Senate threatened to strike, the Graduate and Professional Student Senate would be dissolved.
Right.
In part because striking is illegal in the state of Virginia.
Is it?
Well,
I did not know that. Okay.
Striking has a very narrow legal definition.
Okay.
So the very narrow legal definition of striking is illegal in Virginia. However, things like work slowdowns, only doing 20 hours of work a week like our contracts say we do, even though none of us actually do that. These are all not prohibited, even though they'd also be technically considered as strikes under social movement history. They're not legally considered strike. Okay. So it's not like options are off the table. But having a formally recognized union with collective bargaining rights is also illegal in the state of Virginia. So for some public institutions.
Okay.
It gets a little bit sticky. So for high school teachers, for example, because they report to boards of education locally, they can ask the Board of Education to recognize their union and recognize their right to collective bargaining. We're seeing a campaign for that right now in our own Montgomery County public school systems, by the way. The teachers are looking like they're actually going to win collective bargaining here, which will be exciting. Okay. However, for instance, for employees like graduate students, HR considers graduate students mostly students, unless it's convenient to consider us employees.
Yeah, of course.
But we are defined as students and not employees. But even if we were employees, we are state employees, not local employees. Which means we would have to petition the state government to recognize our union. And the state government has no incentive to do that.
Okay.
So effectively, we don't have the ability to be recognized by a union and have collective bargaining rights. However, in union history, there has not been a single successful union that has relied purely on the state's goodwill to recognize them. So you can still form a union and exercise your power, because ultimately your power doesn't come from the state recognizing you. It comes from the fact that you get, 500 people together to say, this is what we're demanding, and if you don't do it, we will withhold our very essential labor for the university. And I think that, just speaking broadly, we're seeing this be a historic shift in higher education today. We are seeing an unprecedented number of higher education unions forming, especially among graduate students. So right now, the entire higher education system in California is under incredible duress because the graduate students are organized and are demanding the same thing we demanded at Virginia Tech, higher wages. And they're getting it. If you take a look at unionized schools versus non-unionized schools have a much higher rate of graduate student compensation than non-unionized schools across the board. There's been a ton of social science research on this. In every industry, unionized employees get paid more than non-unionized employees. In terms of a graduate union of Virginia Tech, I think that it'd be difficult but not impossible by any stretch, and it wouldn't surprise me in the slightest if graduate students were organizing one. If they saw the living wage campaign or the dire situation in COVID and decided to get together and be like, okay, we need to fight for ourselves, right? Because what I revealed in shared governance is that there are strong limitations to the kind of work we can do, and that when you work within the system, you can have steep repercussions. So I would not be surprised in the slightest if there were groups of graduate students forming a union right this very second. Because of the legal precarity, I'm going to plead the fifth on talking about any specifics, of course, but I will just say that, it is across the country. We're seeing hundreds of graduate unions successfully pop up and demand the same thing that we're winning right now in the living wage campaign. And I could not be happier for them, and I strongly support them, whether they're the university, the university campus workers or UCW chapter in UVA, or whether they're the Northwestern Graduate Union that's just recently voted to formally become a recognized union, or it's the entire California system, or it's the small fries in North Carolina who have been fighting the good fight at NC State and UNC. I think that what we're seeing is a really positive trend in higher education. Okay. And just as a last point, there's a lot to be cynical about higher education that we've already talked about, especially around the incentive for producing employees rather than, educating people. And one of the things that makes me the most optimistic is these graduate unions that are forming across the country. I think that if they manage to hold on to power, that would be a really exciting shift for higher education. And I hope that faculty at the universities take the same note, that staff at the universities take the same note, and that we start to see really strong solidarity between the different elements of higher education that are all vitally important.
Yeah, first of all, I'm really surprised. You said the legal definition of strike and unions is illegal in Virginia.
Yeah, but very I want to stress, very narrow. Yeah. Still plenty of stuff you can do.
that's for the student that doesn't know anything about the legal system. Yeah, just telling them that would be scary. Right?
Well, and that's why I'm also saying that doesn't limit you. It's a very narrow legal definition,
right?
For sure.
But I was also surprised that it never occurred to me that the state needs to recognize the union, because for me, the union is about the students. And if the student recognize themselves as a union, then that's all it is. And then
you're right.
The state or the university will have to deal with whatever the students as a union decide. They can just ignore it, right?
Yes.
Even if they don't officially recognize the thing, right?
Yes, for sure.
So yeah, it's really interesting. I had a small experience with student unionization because I was a student at McGill University in Canada.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
And I was not involved in like any student unions there or even like councils. But I didn't do much political work at the university back then. But a funny story is after I finished and I moved to the States to work, I remember one time I received an envelope, a letter by mail. And I opened it, it's from McGill. I'm like, well, what do they want? And I read it. It was from the Graduate Student Union. I think it was Graduate Student Union, yeah. From, like, it's definitely a student union. I don't know if it's the graduate, but student union.
Yeah.
I received a letter from them said, we have negotiated with the university because, I don't know, something about the GTA workload.
Yeah.
I forget the details. And you are entitled to $100.
Yeah.
And that was after I left the university by probably 4 years. And I'm like, they kept track of that and they fought for this right.
Yeah.
And they sent me money to another country. Like, how powerful is that?
Yeah.
I know there is a lot of criticism for unions. Like, I'm not a political scientist, and I don't think we'll have time to go through that.
Yeah.
So it's not me saying I know what I'm talking about. I just recognize from this small story that unions are very powerful.
Yeah.
If they can get that kind of money to all graduates in retrospect, right? So it's just something to be said about unions, and I think it's something, I don't know. It is important to keep a conversation about, and for the students to talk about whether it is in their best interest or it is important for them to unionize or not.
Yeah. And I will say, I'm in an odd position here, but I want to first and foremost say that story, I think, demonstrates beautifully the power of a union. Most of the critiques of unions are lobbied at sort of the mainline unions like the AFL-CIO, right, whose leadership is questionable, who like whether they listen to their rank and file or whatever. Most graduate student unions aren't like that. Most are very independent, and most are accountable to the graduate students they serve. And that's in no small part why you see such powerful work coming out of them. I as a staff member, I am limited in my ability to endorse anything or something like that. But I will say that across the country, what we see very clearly is that unions provide strong economic benefits to the people who are with them. Whether that's the Postal Workers Union, where unionized postal workers employees make arm and a leg above everybody else in the postal worker, or who are postal workers, or even taking a look at Northwestern. They're right now fighting for a minimum stipend of about $38,000 to $40,000, and we're fighting for $33,000. And yeah, their cost of living is higher, but also not $7,000 high.
Right.
And so, I think that there's clear economic advantages to it. As a social movement historian, I'd say most of the big wins for laborers, for staff members, have come from sustained labor organizing. As part of my social movement theory of change, we have a 5-day work week because of union organizers. We have overtime pay because of union organizers. We have workplace protections and OSHA because of union organizers. We owe so much of our livelihood to union organizers. That I would be very excited to see what that would look like in terms of shaping higher education, is what I'll say. Okay,
let's see where this movement goes.
We'll see.
Okay, I'm gonna try to be quicker because we should leave around 2, and
okay.
I don't want the episode to be too long for people to follow. But there are still 2 things I really want to talk about.
Great.
So you have pushed for many resolutions when you were president. Like there was a resolution about the environment, a resolution about student wage, but there was one resolution, I don't know what it's called. I think it's called Standing with Palestine or
Boycott, Divest, Sanctions.
Right.
Yeah.
And I want to talk a little bit about this, not because I'm trying to be controversial or anything, but I think it's a really important story. And I have a few questions about its implications in the abstract, not as an individual one. Yeah. But okay, so I was not part of GPSS back then, so I think you can talk a lot more about it than me. And first of all, can you give us a very brief account of what happened And
Yeah.
so we can discuss it from an activism perspective.
For sure.
Yeah.
So 3 of the resolutions I tried to advance were divestment resolutions for the University Foundation. So our money is tied up in a 501c3 foundation called the Virginia Tech Foundation. They invest our money and yield a return on investment to give out to scholarships. But what industries they're invested, because they're not a public institution, they're a nonprofit, is hard to identify. And so as students, I felt like we had a responsibility to interrogate what industries they were invested in and making sure they were ethical industries. So I advanced 3 resolutions to that point. The first was what you're talking about, a divestment from fossil fuel industries, because we believe that to be an unethical industry. A divestment from military and police technology development companies or surveillance companies like Palantir. And then the third one, and this was the only one people seem to care about, was complying with the Boycott, Divest, Sanctions movement to divest resources and academic influence from the occupying state of Israel in support, in solidarity with Palestinians who are currently facing apartheid conditions. Out of all my resolutions, this was by far the most controversial and garnered the most discussion. People were calling for me to be dismissed. People were calling for this resolution to be even prevented from being discussed democratically. And just as a quick side note, when I was the president of the Senate, I introduced 2 additional readings of a resolution. That means they get heard by the Senate, where my senators could vote to table it, to amend it, to do whatever they wanted. And these are unnecessary steps in terms of shared governance. So I introduced basically 2 extra opportunities for people to strike this down if they didn't support it.
Right.
They still did. And as a result of this work, as happens often in Palestinian solidarity work, I was the target of a lot of hatred. So I'm Jewish, it's worth mentioning, advancing this resolution in solidarity with Palestine. And I was the target of 11 weeks of anti-Semitic death threats, Holocaust imagery, vile hate speech. My team, who was predominantly women, had a lot of sexist comments thrown at them. My Senate, which is more diverse than I am, had a lot of racial epithets thrown at them. I had ethnic slurs thrown at me often. And I have a Google Drive right now of 250 examples of this sort of hate speech towards me. That lasted 11 weeks. To my knowledge, I think it's the largest anti-Semitic attack in our campus's history, actually. And the response from the university was sort of muted, I would say. And we can get into what that looked like specifically later on if we want.
Yep.
But as a result of that, a lot of things happened, and most severely, actually, and this is, I don't think we talked about this beforehand, just to have a peek behind the curtain, we talked beforehand.
Right.
But what also resulted from it was state legislation targeting us specifically. So I have videos of lobbying groups in Richmond, Virginia, pushing the state governor, Youngkin, and the state senate even last year to consider adding resolutions that would ban higher education universities from discussing BDS, would ban it from implementing it through contract limitations. And in fact, Jason Miyares, the Attorney General of Virginia right now, put out a letter to all higher education institutions, in part because of the work that I did, because we were really the only BDS campus, or campus pushing BDS out of Virginia in the last several years, to basically crack down on BDS and any criticism of Israel. And because we were the only campus doing this, and because they named the lobbying groups named Virginia Tech specifically, and because I'm named in a lot of these articles that these lobbying groups are using to support their claims, there was about 6 resolutions that were at least in part because of the work that we did at Virginia Tech. HB, I know the numbers. HB 16-something last year, which died in committee, and 5 this legislative cycle as a result of the work of Executive Order 8, which also was partially because of me, potentially. 4 of those are now dead in the Senate. One of them is actually being heard today. So hopefully it doesn't make my dissertation a hate crime, because I criticize Israel in my dissertation as a political scholar. But we're going to see. After this talk, I might have a text that says, and by the way, you got to be more careful with your work. But this has had serious repercussions from the local level, with groups trying to get me fired or displaced from this, to all the way to the state level, with state legislation being introduced to target this work specifically. So it's been a lot.
And my understanding, you were a target of a lot, not just hate, but even threats.
Yes.
Yeah. So it was a pretty intense thing, and I'm sorry you had to go through that. But one thing that really surprises me is, like you said, this all these all of this was done under democracy, right? Like you had a reading in GPSS and people voted on it
Twice.
And so it really surprises me that you were attacked. I mean, I know other people were attacked as well, but this is not just you. This is you representing the graduate students, right?
That's right.
So I feel that is really important.
Yeah.
An important fact in this conversation to not make this as a personal thing, right?
Yeah.
So there are a couple of things I want to talk about in regard to this. So just to clarify, I am an Arab. I come from Syria. And, being an Arab and growing up in an Arab country, I am very familiar with the grievances of the Palestinian people and, all the wars that happened, all the, I understand what they have been through.
Yeah.
And, Arabs have this sympathy to Palestinians in particular because of this history, right? However, sometimes I try to take myself out of this subjective lens and think about myself as just a student at VT. And I wonder if I wasn't an Arab, how I would feel about this. And let's say something happened, I don't know, in some, Latin American country where I have no personal ties to. I would definitely, if there is something humanitarian, I would feel sympathy and empathy, right? But I might not go as far as in like protesting or making such strong statements and passing resolutions, right? Because I would be like, okay, I'm just a student. I'm just here to get my education, right? I'm not as motivated to go about this because there is a lot of conflict in the world.
Yeah.
There is a lot of bad things happening. And sadly, some of these are actually complex conflicts. Like I come from Syria, right? There is a civil war there. And, in one family, you sometimes have brothers that don't talk to each other because one brother is pro government, one brother is pro the rebels, whatever, right? And I know after years it's not black and white, it's not good and evil. There are things on both sides that we can talk about. But what I'm trying to get at is, as a student, why would I want to involve myself with this? Why don't I, not just me as a student, but also the GPSS, divert resources and time to things that are more impacting to the student, like the wage issue, like maybe parking, right? What is the value, in your opinion, of chasing after these political statements to the student?
Yeah, I think that first and foremost, it's important to recognize that higher education in the 21st century is deeply multicultural. And so this is an issue that does directly affect many Palestinian graduate students and undergraduate students around campus who have likely been displaced from their homeland. That was part of the path that led them here. So I think for that reason, as long as it's important to a group of students, it's worth bringing up in the Senate and as a political issue. I think more largely that I believe in the power of education to tackle political issues significantly. I think that higher education institutions have always been a battleground of politics, always. And I think in particular with the issue of Palestine, so much of it interacts with higher education. The way that we exchange knowledge with Israeli universities, the way that we exchange technologies with Israel, the ways in which we are often invested in Israeli companies as a state institution. Right. Not many people know this, but Virginia has a specific advisory board for encouraging economic relationships between Israel and Virginia, right? It's called the Virginia-Israel Advisory Board, VIAB. And so they are singled out. No other foreign country has this as building economic partnerships with our state. And so because of that, I feel a really strong motivation to take an ethical stand when I see apartheid circumstances. And for the record, the majority of graduate students agreed to me. It wasn't even close. I think the vote ended up being 65% in favor, 25% against, and then a bunch of abstentions. Okay. And so I think that we have an ethical issue. I'd also point to historical precedent here as well. So during the apartheid South African regime, higher education boycotts, very similar, if not identical to BDS, were instrumental in toppling that regime. I think that people don't understand how big of institutions groups like Virginia Tech are. You know, we are a $1.7 billion institution with $1.4 billion in our foundation. Okay. And we're small. UVA, much bigger foundation and footprint. Old Dominion, big footprint. GMU, big footprint. You know, across the state of Virginia, tens of billions of dollars are invested in higher education, right? That puts us leagues above any company that exists in this state.
Right.
It's incredibly impactful, and we invest hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars into certain investments, including other countries. And during the protests against apartheid South Africa, getting universities to divest not just financial resources, but academic resources, you know, not sending scholars to South Africa in protest of their government, sheltering South African scholars who were fleeing the apartheid government, and then also cutting off hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billions of dollars, played a key role in ending apartheid in South Africa. And of course, it's always the activists, both on the ground here, but most importantly on the ground in South Africa, that did the hard work, put their lives at risk to do this. But we got to remember that during this time, the school of cops were tear gassing and pepper spraying student activists for pushing for divestment, right? Far worse than what I received, but for standing up for the right thing to do and opposing apartheid.
Right.
So for me, I really think of the BDS movement in that spirit and as the you know, logical extension of opposing apartheid. Okay. And for me, I think that also makes it worth tackling. And I recognize that history of social movements in universities as being vital for democracy across the world.
So you like, for you, this is really about the students standing for their beliefs and convictions about what's right or wrong.
Yes.
Even if it's at their own time and resources and expense.
Yes.
Right? And I find it interesting, like what you said about the apartheid in South Africa, like, because, you know, hindsight is 20/20, and sometimes we don't know, like now, what people take for granted about, let's say, Hitler, or is not to say, like, I am not trying to make any political statement.
I mean, Hitler was Time Magazine's
like
Man
South
of the Year.
Africa is like Israel. I'm not trying to make any political statements here.
Sure.
But what I'm getting as is what we now take for granted historically was not for granted. Like you said about the tear gas earlier. Yeah. I know historically, like, the U.S. did not intervene in preventing the Jewish genocide during World War II till much later in the war. Right.
There's that famous image of two boats being turned away from New York City full of Jewish refugees from the Holocaust.
Right.
Yeah, 100%.
So what we now take for granted is like, Hitler was bad. And everyone wanted to stop him. Yeah. Well, it wasn't that simple back then, you know. He was Time Magazine's Man of the Year. Yeah.
People. Exactly. There were Nazi sympathizers publicly in playing Madison Square Garden for tens of thousands of people. Right. So 100%. Yeah.
Right. So there's, So I get your point that really for you it's about standing for what you believe in. Which I respect, and I wanted your voice to reach to the audience here, and like for you to explain like where this comes from, and like we said before, this was a democratic process. Whether someone agrees with it or not, my job here is not to say whether I agree with it or not. My job is to say, you know, democracy. This is how democracy works, and I don't know. I have respect for democracy.
I appreciate it. I also do. And I want to stress again, it is the official stance of the graduate students to support BDS by a clear majority, not even close.
And one last thing, I don't know, I can cut this if you don't want to talk about it, but I know that you went through a lot of, you tried to get the university support for you personally after you got all these threats. Yeah. I want to ask you about, like, how did you find this support or lack of? And probably, I mean, you can talk about your personal experience, but I want to also emphasize, like, do you think this was an isolated case of lack of support for you, or do you think there's a systematic problem in the university of supporting people who are in similar situations? Yeah.
To answer the last question first, I think there's 100% a lack of systemic support, and I'm going to get into that. But first, I do want to say that when I was seeking support, it was really for my team and I. So I made myself the figurehead of this intentionally. I'm a white Jew. I thought that would protect me from the worst of it. And based on the harassment that people at other universities have gotten for similar campaigns, I think it definitely reduced the amount of harassment I got. But most of the harassment was targeted towards me specifically. So oftentimes I'd frame my requests in support for, our team or the Senate, who is also under fire. And a lot of it would have also helped me. So I reached out to a bunch of different offices on campus and did get a modicum of support. So the strongest support I got was the former vice president of student affairs, Frank Shushak, who unequivocally supported me on social media and named what I was going through. Most people saw the statement that the president put out, President Sands. He didn't name what I was going through, but he did stand up for my right to argue this in the Senate in a democratic way. The president is a big believer in academic freedom. He opposed Miyares when Miyares tried to say you need to crack down on any criticism of Israel, and he basically replied, I'm not going to tell my faculty and students like what they can and can't criticize politically. And so he's been a big defender of academic freedom, but he didn't take a side and he didn't name what the harassment was, which was the largest anti-Semitic attack in campus history. The biggest office that I reached out to was the Office of Inclusion and Diversity. I reached out to them over 8 times. Mostly was met with silence, and oftentimes they made the situation worse. And I'm certainly not going to name names. I think that would be deeply inappropriate, but it's no secret, and I think that it wouldn't be controversial for me to say that the Office of Inclusion and Diversity didn't and still hasn't made a single policy change, hasn't had a single educational event about what I went through, hasn't introduced anything to prevent these sort of targeted harassment campaigns that I experienced or that faculty members like Crystal Lane Duncan experienced. I have yet to see anything concrete that they've done to prevent this from happening again, and that's disappointing, if I'm going to be honest. I expect better from our inclusion office. And I hope that they do learn from this experience and do better, but given that it's been a year and a half since the largest anti-Semitic attack in campus history and that office hasn't done anything, I'm not really holding my breath. Right. And to be honest, if you talk to anybody who does this sort of activism work or diversity work on campus, they probably have a similar story about that office. There is something deeply structurally wrong with how we carry this out.
I actually wanted to ask about that because we have talked offline before, right? And I'm a little more familiar about what you personally went through.
Yeah.
My question, do you think this lack of, I don't know if I want to call it lack of sympathy, does it stem from the university trying to protect itself? What do you think? Can you unpack that? Like, what do you think is going on behind the curtain that is preventing you or people in similar situations? Because I don't want to make this to be about this specific story. I want to talk in general. What is preventing the university from providing that support? Is it funding? Is it protecting them politically? What is it?
I think that the university is going to give a lot of different reasons, but I think it gets back to our original conversation about, what people see the institution of the university as being for, right? What are its values? And if it valued things like justice or diversity or education or fighting anti-Semitism, then even if there were risks attached, it would still take those risks. You'll get all sorts of excuses coming from funding to worries about political repercussions publicly or not getting as many students. I've had many conversations with the president about this, and it's not a surprise to me that his statement was so neutral. I'm not blaming him for that. As the president of the university, he couldn't take a side on the political issue because that would risk public funding. And I sincerely appreciate his commitment to academic freedom for having these discussions. I'm still disappointed that there wasn't strong support, right, in doing the right thing and taking that risk. But I at least understand from his perspective that decision to put out the statement. From the Office of Inclusion and Diversity, I think it's something far deeper. I think it's about how the university actually values diversity. They want to get these metrics. They want to show that we have a certain percentage of Black faculty members, a certain percentage of international students. But when it comes to actually making sure that there's inclusion involved, I haven't yet to see anything to convince me that there's meaningful support behind that. Okay. Which is not to say that certain institutions don't do a great job. I have nothing but respect for the cultural and community centers who do amazing work. But it's also an open secret that anytime they try to go beyond their purview and advocate for these groups, there are severe institutional repercussions. And I think that the answer is complicated and ties to the values reflected in our country and the values reflected in our education and the fact that higher education is continuing to be this culture war between the right and the left, right? We're talking about critical race theory here being this boogeyman for right-wingers. And so there's definitely these political and value-based issues at play. But I think at the end of the day, it's just about the institution not having the political will to do this the right way. And you see that anytime you criticize them for it, because there's just this allergy to admitting that there's been a mistake. And if you can't even admit that there's been a mistake, or that it's, revealing something bad about the institution to not address the largest anti-Semitic attack in campus history when they've had a year and a half to do it, I think that says something about how the values they preach aren't the values they practice. And that's what it comes down for me. Especially since a lot of the things I recommended were not expensive. They weren't controversial. I tried to get OID to advocate for mental health triage resources for anybody who goes through harassment. So basically just establishing a relationship with Cook to say, hey, this faculty member who normally couldn't access Cook, if they're being targeted, they should get immediate mental health resources, no questions asked, right? I don't think that's a controversial suggestion to make, and yet there has been no movement on it. There's been no adoption of it, and as far as I'm aware, there hasn't been any internal discussions of it.
Right.
So, that to me, that speaks to not a fear of repercussion. It speaks to an unwillingness to prioritize this.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Again, I'm sorry you had to go through that, and I'm sorry your experience was not so good, to put it mildly. And I hope things get better, not just for you.
Yeah.
I think we want institutions that advocate more for the
100%.
student. So I hope if things didn't turn out the way they should have been for you, I hope in the future, the future students get a better treatment.
I hope so too. And I think there's reason to suspect that's the case. And, we've seen improvements. I know I've been pretty grim for the last hour, but I do think there's reasons to see that's the case.
Good. All right. Last 5 minutes.
Yes.
Okay.
Let's finish up.
The other thing I want to talk about, one of your important resolutions is the student wage.
Yes.
Okay. So can you also give us a brief account of how that went? And I have some hearsay things that I heard about it. I might or might not mention them. I don't know. But first, give us an account what happened about that.
So similar to the other resolutions, I advanced this because I heard a clear demand from the graduate students. Second only to parking, this was the most complained about thing. The average stipend at Virginia Tech's about $21,000. If you subtract fees from that, it's about $18,000, which is under the line for food stamps, which we can't actually get because on paper we make $21,000 because fees aren't taken into account. I was reading one of the studies from a Virginia Tech professor, Ralph Hall, who put together this food insecurity study, which was a survey of Virginia Tech students, both undergrad and graduate, and the rates of food insecurity they faced. And he found, it's been a while since I parroted these statistics, so double check me if I'm wrong about this, audience, but about a 49% food insecurity rate among international graduate students and a 35% food insecurity rate among domestic students, which is utterly horrifying. Right? Graduate students are literally starving by the thousands is what that statistic means, given how many graduate students we have. And so I decided to make this a real spearhead of my campaign because we needed something to be done about it. And not just the regular 5% raises that we're used to seeing. We needed a big step up because it was very clear based on the food insecurity, based on the cost of housing, based on inflation, that graduate students weren't making enough to survive in this area, which means they're not doing the best work for the university. They have deep mental health issues as a result of financial precarity. And there's just a wealth of problems that arise from this. So we pushed this forward. It was controversial. A lot of the administration in particular were against it, but graduate students turned up to support it.
Okay.
So the way that the resolutions all went was from the Senate to a commission to the University Council. So in the Senate, it passed near unanimously. I think it was like 48-2 or
Makes
something.
sense.
Yeah, makes sense. Well, not a surprise there for people. In the committee, the commission for CGPSP is what it was called at the time. It's sort of been rearranged a little bit. Excuse me. So there, it got a little bit more pushback because that's when you start to open it up to the broader university community. Okay. Graduate school pushed back against us. The faculty senate pushed back against us. And what ended up happening was we had several meetings revisiting it, restructuring it, figuring out the best way to present it. And that's really where the living wage campaign was forged. And it ended up being a really interesting negotiation that strengthened the resolution as a result of all the feedback and pushback. But ultimately, it wasn't going to pass until we got 80 graduate students into the room to support it. And this is normally like a 15-person meeting. Nobody comes to the shared governance meetings. They're very boring most times. I don't blame them. But we got 80 graduate students to show up and be like, no, this on like 1 day notice to be like, hey, this is the most important issue to us. We need to see this go through. And it did. It passed unanimously in the commission level because of that. Then it got up to University Council, and this is where I suspect much of the audience probably remembers it. It went through 3 different readings or considerations in the University Council. For the first meeting, we knew we had to turn up to show how important this was, right? There was only 2 grad student representatives and 68 non-grad students on there. You know, there wasn't a clear understanding of the depths of poverty the graduate students were facing. And so 500 graduate students showed up to what's normally a very boring 70-person meeting. And it changed the atmosphere of that room. The second reading, we got 350 people to show up. The third reading, and that's very unusual. Normally there's only 2 readings, but this was highly controversial. The third reading, another 350 people showed up. And so the president eventually saw how important this was, and to his credit, before it was even voted on, was basically just like put out a memo that said, I see how important this is. We're going to go ahead with this regardless of the vote.
Okay.
Which was unprecedented.
Amazing. Okay.
And it eventually passed with more support than the shared governance changes, which had been worked on for about 3 years because of the public outcry. Then it moved into a task force to set the number. The last I heard, the number was around 33,000, and hopefully it'll be going up in front of the Board of Visitors March 19th and March 20th when they consider financial implications.
Okay, so somewhat success story, and I'm happy to hear that the president was really supporting this, and this is another demonstration of the student power. Like you said, like when you go in numbers and show solidarity to each other, then you get things done. I want to get more detail, like when you say this is controversial, why is it controversial? Because to me, like everyone can see that grad students are not paid well, even though they're overworked actually, much more than in contract. Instead, in addition to their, they have to do classes and all of those, right? What is the controversial part? I sometimes don't think I can see it.
So, and this is funny because in all the meetings, everybody would be like, well, we support you in spirit, but the number you're asking for is ridiculous. And that's always been sort of funny to me because we make money for the university. They pretend we're such a burden, but graduate students, if you crunch the numbers, actually make a profit for the university of a lot of money. But the reason it's controversial is because it's an open secret in higher education in general that higher education runs off of graduate students. It runs off of our labor. We're the ones in the lab making sure those $1 million grants get fulfilled and that the universities get a 60% cut of. So, that's $600,000 of profit to the university because of a small team of grad students who are making 21. We're the ones teaching almost all the intro classes, right? If you're teaching 2 sections of introductory English each semester as an English TA and you're making $23,000, if you crunch the numbers per student, that's making the university a net profit after they pay you like $23,000 plus expenses plus tuition and all that. That still makes the university a net profit of about $80,000 a year per one individual grad student. So the open secret is that if they paid us more, that would cut into their bottom line. And I think the controversy comes out of faculty members don't want to write that into their grants. The administration doesn't want to increase the percentage of the budget that's allocated to grad student stipends. But, when there's clear need, our argument was always that, listen, we hear you. You don't want to pay us a full, faculty rate. We're not asking for that. We don't want to get paid a full postdoc rate. We're not asking for that. What we are asking for is to be making the minimum cost of living at least, if not more. So that we can survive comfortably because of all the valuable work we do for the university. Because we're making you 80 grand and only making 21 grand ourselves, we need to make more so that we're actually brought up to not having to worry about one medical expense wiping us out or food insecurity.
So it seems to me it's a system in place that the people who benefit from the system are fighting to maintain it.
Always. Yeah. And not just here, by the way, at all institutions.
Right. Yeah, it's not just Virginia Tech. It's generally... And that, I don't know, like that, I'm at the loss of words because I thought we were past this kind of systems where, like, I don't want to call it slavery, but, where you know you're not giving a certain demographic what they deserve. but you still want to maintain it because you don't want to disrupt how much money the other factions in this system make, right? So I don't know. I don't know what to say about that, but I am wondering if, like, do you think let's say you said the faculty don't want to write it in their grants and stuff. Do you think there is I don't want to call it malicious intention, but do they understand what this means to graduate student? Is it just plain ignorance, or is there like a malicious intention? What do you think it is? Just to be clear, I think that the majority of faculty would probably be open to this, but I think that faculty members who occupy a position of power and who have ambitions for administration share their investment in keeping this system. Okay. So I think that the people who are most outspoken or who are representing the faculty, I think their desire to be part of the administration one day guides their loud opposition to this. Because from what we had a lot of faculty members show up to the board or the university council meetings as well. We had probably about 50 or 60 in support of us. So it's not all the faculty by any means, but the ones in positions of power want to hold on to that advance. And my question is, what is their argument? Like, I understand what you said that they don't want this to happen, but what arguments do they put publicly to say, oh, we can't do this because what?
It's would cut into the budget, and they'd have to raise tuition potentially, even though that's not necessarily true. You know, why would they hire a grad student for $33K if they could exploit a postdoc for around that amount of money? Gotcha. Which is an absurd argument that just says to me that we need to be paying postdocs better too. But you know, it's really trying to make the opportunity cost argument that really doesn't hold water. And some of them do have an almost malicious argument around, well, we're doing you a favor by giving you an education, and therefore we're allowed to we're morally justified in underpaying you. They haven't crunched the numbers. It's very clear when you do any sort of economic analysis, even for somebody like me who's teaching, like, when I was a grad student teaching one class a semester, and it was like a 20-person class, I'm still making a tidy profit of about $20,000 for the university. Right. Easy. Right. So,
Right. Like, I mean, for me, it's important to know what arguments they're putting publicly, because that's how we need to respond.
For sure.
Because I don't know, this is hearsay. I don't know if it actually happened, but I heard that someone said in that meeting that, like, they were addressing the graduate student, you're not the only one starving here. Which to me sounds like, really, that's your best argument. Like, not only that is insensitive and such a horrendous thing to say. That's not even an argument.
Yes.
So that's why I was asking you, because I wanted to hear, like, is there a more rational argument here that I should be paying attention to? And we try to respond to using facts and critical thinking, like you said.
If I was to be generous to my opponents, I think that the most convincing argument for me is we want to keep cost of education down, and, you know, graduate students are paid out of E&G money. We don't have to get into the finance of the university, but that means ultimately, like, you know, you could increase tuition to support this living wage campaign. However, if you take a look at a $1.7 billion institution, if we were trying to get graduate students to $33K next year, that would cost the university about $25 to $30 million a year. And that, by the way, we want to waive fees with that too. So no more fees. No more paying $3,000 at the beginning of each semester. Right. Or $1,500 at the beginning of each semester. $25 million out of a $1.7 billion institution does not strike me as a particularly strong argument for increasing the tuition dollars, especially when we're willing to spend hundreds of millions on an innovation campus in Northern Virginia, $55 million, if not more, because the project keeps exceeding budget, on a new military research lab behind Lane Hall. You know, Tim Sands makes $700,000 plus about $250,000 in benefits. You know, that's a known fact that's on public record. He hasn't taken a pay cut a single year that he's been president. His salary goes up every year. If we're really so strapped for cash and can't pay the starving graduate students without increasing tuition, which we don't want to do, you know, I'd love to see the administration really take the moral high ground and start cutting their own pay first before they even consider the possibility of not, you know, paying graduate students enough to live and survive in the town of Blacksburg or Christiansburg.
But no one is going to do that.
No, and so I'm sympathetic to the argument that we want to keep tuition low, and I strongly want to keep tuition low. Right. But if they're suggesting that paying grad students enough to eat is the place where we need to start cutting corners, I stop being sympathetic to that argument, especially given all the financial resources at our disposal.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm sorry to wrap up this grim ending, grim point for ending, but at least. Thanks to you and GPSS generally, and
to the 500 people who showed up, which is get organized, get together with other people. Right. That's how we make change.
Exactly. Thanks to student power and getting together, at least you made progress, and one step at a time. Maybe eventually it will get better and better and better.
I hope I can come back on this a year from now and be like, we did it. We have 33 now, and it's been going great. I get to change some of the cynical positions I've been taking. I think that'd be a really, really happy podcast.
Yes.
Well, we'll see. We'll see in March.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah.
Well, Jack, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
I really enjoyed this conversation. It was such a nice conversation. Actually, this was very long, so I might have to split it into two episodes.
That'd be fun.
But I enjoyed every bit of it. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. I had so much fun talking about these really important issues to the students.
Yeah. And maybe we'll meet in a future episode sometime. Again.
I hope so. All right.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Have a wonderful day, and see you in a next episode.